Morning. Welcome to the 2011 Emerging Trends Seminar. We'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us today as we present and exchange ideas about the future of scholarly publishing. 2011 is a milestone for this event. Although Allen Press has been doing educational seminars for over 30 years, this marks the 10th consecutive year we've held the Emerging Trends Seminar here in DC. It's kind of interesting. Earlier this week I was looking at some old programs, and it's interesting to reflect back on what we were talking about 10 years ago. So online manuscript submission, XML composition, digital workflows, even online publishing were really still new ideas. Those ideas really changed the way we manage and deliver content, how we communicate, and really how we do business. If we fast forward to now, 10 years later, we're seeing a disruption in the industry that we could really only begin to imagine back then. This year's seminar theme, Form Follows Function, letting users design the new architecture, really speaks to this transformation. The new future and the new architecture of scholarly publishing is really a work in progress. It's being designed in real time by readers, by authors, by researchers, by academics, by all types of consumers of content. Its structure is really evolving as we speak, and its form is being defined by the functions required by those users of content. Today's program will look at this new architecture from a number of different angles, and I think we're in for a great day of interesting topics and engaging speakers. You'll hear some thoughts from experienced industry veterans, and you'll also hear some new voices. So I think you'll find all the presentations quite thought-provoking and compelling, and really a great starting point for discussion and dialogue. Before we jump into the presentation, I do need to go over some housekeeping items. So if you look at the first page of your program, if you tweet, we do have a Twitter hashtag for this event. It's hashtag Trends 2011. Also, we do have free Wi-Fi connection, and there is a correction to the information in your program. We have two selections, and if you were in the front of the room, I'd ask you to use the Embassy Wi-Fi selection when you go in and look at the selections for your environments. And if you're in the back of the room, please use Linksys, L-I-N-K-S-Y-S. And those should actually populate to the top on this as the strongest connections. Also, presentations will be available online on our website, and you see the address there, events/2011/presentations. The PowerPoints will be available. We're also videotaping today. Joanna Gillette is making her directorial debut, taken for us today. So those will be online, actually by early next week, hopefully Monday, but we'll get them up there quite quickly. There is a list of pre-registered attendees available at the registration desk. And it will be available after the seminar at www.alpress.com. I did want to talk about the mobile tagging. So you may notice when you registered, there was a 2D tag or Microsoft tag. This is a networking system, essentially. These tags contain a V card that has the attendee's name, organization, and an email address if you gave that when you registered. If you have a smartphone and you download the Microsoft Tag Reader, you can scan this tag, and it will prompt you on your smartphone to enter that contact information into your device. If you're not interested in that, you can either return those tags to the desk or toss them. With a lot of things and emerging trends, technology has outstripped our social skills, so there isn't really an etiquette in terms of how you scan someone's badge, but I would just ask you to be polite and ask them before you walk up and just scan them. We get enough of that in the airport, right? We're also using Microsoft Tag for the survey this year, so if you don't want to use the paper survey, you can actually, once again, scan with your smartphone and complete that survey online. with that, I'd like to begin with our first speaker of the day. So, Nikolaus Kriegeskorte. We're going to speak about peer review. Everyone's coming up here, I'll introduce him. Nico is a brain scientist who studies visual object recognition in humans and monkeys using functional magnetic resonance imaging, pattern information analysis, and computational modeling. He's a principal investigator of the Medical Research Council's Cognition and Brain Sciences unit in Cambridge, UK. He studied psychology and computer science in Cologne, Germany, did his thesis research at the Frankfurt Max Planck Institute for Brain Research at Maastricht University, where his advisor was Radir Gobel, and he worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Minnesota Center for Magnetic Resonance Research, and he also worked at National Institutes of Health here in DC for 6 years.
Thanks a lot, Tim. It's an honor to be here and kind of an adventure because I never go to publishing conferences so far, so I usually only go to scientific conferences, and this is a bit of a side project for me, imagining how the publication system and in particular evaluation of papers could work in the future. I think a publication system needs to provide two basic functions. I don't know what they are from your perspective. I don't know what's in your mind when you hear that, but from my perspective, they seem to be access to papers and evaluation of papers. We need access so that we can read anything, and we need evaluation so that we don't have to read everything. And that becomes more and more important as the scientific literature explodes. However, in the traditional system, the access is restricted by requiring payment, and the evaluation is restricted by making the evaluation process, the peer review process, a secret process that goes on only before publication and is usually restricted to 2 to 4 opinions from other experts. There's a movement to address the drawbacks of the first function in the current system, that's the open access movement. And from a scientist's perspective, I can say that this is largely seen as a desirable thing, and it's slowly becoming a reality. However, for the second function, which is really half of the picture from my perspective, there is no such movement. So I think what the future will see is an open evaluation movement where we're opening up the peer review and evaluation process as well. So what does open evaluation mean? It means a post-publication evaluative process of peer review, but not just review, but also peer ratings. So these are explicit judgments, and that's in contrast to article metrics like views and downloads, etc., which might also become very, very important, obviously, right? But I think that that's not going to be the whole story. There will continue to be a reliance on explicit judgments from peer scientists. And these reviews could be signed or anonymous, and I think the system should be open in this respect also, allowing both signed and anonymous evaluations. So the current system, in a nutshell, works like this. There's the research and the writing up of the research, then we have an unpublished paper. This goes into secret peer review, which takes about a year because it might be rejected at high level initially and then resubmitted. And then we have a published paper. Now the moment the paper is published, the reviews go into the trash in the sense that the community cannot access them because this was all done in secret. So all these thoughts from the reviewers who work very hard on evaluating the paper also not fed back into the scientific process. And then as the paper is published, the only indication of the quality of the paper is the prestige of the journal that it appeared in initially. And that's, I think, a big problem and kind of a waste, because in the reviews we have very detailed evaluative information, often ratings on different scales, and also sort of elaborate texts explaining sort of pros and cons or possible caveats of the research. And then there's the reception process, which generates citations. So about 10 years later, we have another much delayed but ultimately important index of quality, which is the number of citations that a paper received. I think in the future it's going to be more like this. We're going to have the research and the writing, and we're going to instantly publish the paper. So when there's no longer going to be submission, but we'll publish instead. And then we're going to have a merged process of reception of the paper, which includes evaluation by peers. So after 3 months or something, the paper might have an initial 3 reviews. Those would be the equivalent of what we have in the current system, only they'd be open. And later on, if the paper is sufficiently important, it will be further evaluated, and we'll have more data to base our final judgment on. And then, of course, also there'll be citing papers at some point. So I think of open evaluation, to make this a little bit more concrete, as open post-publication peer review, where review is a little bit more general and includes ratings as well. So what does this mean in detail? Open means open to post. Anyone can instantly post a review. It's open to access. Anyone can instantly access any review. Each review is permanently linked to the paper. The reviews are digitally authenticated at different levels. For example, they could be signed reviews, which I think will play an important role in the future, because they, if a scientist stands by his judgment, then that judgment has much more weight, and the scientist will be highly motivated to sort of stand the test of time with his or her judgment. In addition, signed reviews provide some kind of incentive for reviewers to do their job, as reviewing will then be seen as what it really is, which is making one's contribution as a scientist to steering the attention of the entire field. There should also be unsigned reviews, and they could be either unsigned but authenticated. For example, I could write a review as an authenticated member of the Society for Neuroscience without revealing my identity, or they could be unauthenticated. So at that level, even lay people could contribute to the process, which is desirable. Only in the final evaluation, we might want to downweight those results, but we don't have to make that decision up front. The system will be post-publication, because in order for the reviewing to be open, it has to be post-publication. If the papers aren't available, then obviously the community cannot respond to a paper. And review and reception will be an integrated, ongoing process after publication. Finally, reviews will no longer decide about or delay publication, but they will just evaluate published work. And finally, it's a peer review system. Peer review is not perfect, but it is the best evaluation mechanism we have, I think. And the most serious drawbacks of peer review derive from the fact that it's currently a secret process. So let's look at the nature of a review in the current system and in the future system for a moment. In the current system, a review is a secret communication to authors and editors. In the future system, a review will be an open letter to the community. So it's more similar to getting up at a conference and commenting on a talk. In the current system, a review decides about publication. In the future system, a review will evaluate published work. In the current system, a reviewer's motivation is both selfless and selfish. Selfless in the sense of scientific objectivity, and I think that it really is a strong motivation. From my own experience, I can say that the majority of the reviews that I've gotten have been by people who are really brilliant and experts in the field and striving to be objective. But it's also selfish in the sense of science politics. For example, if you get a paper for review that cites your work heavily and relies upon that, you might be tempted to look upon it more favorably. And it's very hard to draw the line there between just judging that whole direction to be a good direction for science and being just sort of motivated by one's own personal gain. And this, there is sort of scope for this because of the secrecy, right? And the antidote to corruption is transparency, I think. In the future system, the reviewer's motivation will also be selfish as well as selfless. Selfless, again, in terms of wanting to be objective. Selfish in this system in terms of wanting to look smart and objective in public. Right? So that's a selfish motivation, but it's a much better incentive for a high quality judgment that will stand the test of time, that the scientist will feel he or she can stand by 10 years later. In the current system, a weak argument can make or break a paper. In the future system, an argument will only be as powerful as it is compelling. So let's imagine this a little bit more concretely. In the beginning, we'll have a published, author-authenticated, unreviewed paper. Then there could be something like a peer-to-peer editing process where the authors ask some senior scientist to edit the paper. The editor then chooses 3 reviewers and asks them to openly review the paper, and the editor would be named on the paper. So the paper would then get these reviews. And you can think of the reviews, including text and numerical ratings, as kind of in the back of the paper, backing it up. You don't have to look at them. Maybe you can make them visible if you want to look at them, but you don't have to. But the evaluative information is just there, linked to the paper. And then we can have sort of ratings on multiple scales. And importantly, we'll have error bars for those ratings, so we can finally bring science and statistics to the evaluation process, and we can say whether 2 papers, for example, are significantly different in the evaluations that they've received, which is very important. And we can combine these different ratings, for example, by a weighted average, to compute an overall score for each paper and prioritize the entire literature. So if a paper receives a high score, like in this case, 86th percentile score, it might get additional ratings. So this weighted average would be an example of a paper evaluation function, which is a function that takes all the evaluative meta information and combines it into a single dimension. The simplest case is this weighted average, but individuals or groups could define their own paper evaluation functions to prioritize the literature according to their own criteria and needs. So if a paper does very well, it's likely to get more reviews, and that's only going to happen for particularly exciting papers, obviously. And this means that it sort of acquires more evidence to back it up, and it means that those error bars are going to get smaller over time on those ratings. So now the score of the paper has changed, for example, right? And if this process continues, and there's actually substantial evidence from a large number of scientists that have been interested, because it's not only good, but it's also a very important paper that has a lot of consequences, then at some point the paper might be ready to be showcased in magazines like Science and Nature. So another sort of slightly more out there version of this idea of paper evaluation functions is the idea that we have this network of nodes where the nodes are papers and evaluative links that are weighted, that are in these ratings, and we can run fancy algorithms, inference algorithms, on this network. For example, Bayesian belief propagation, where we analyze, sort of recurrently analyze the structure of this network of scientific claims and how they relate to each other. But this would not be sort of a core part of the system, but this would be something that someone could build and run just on this publicly available evaluative information. So in the end, these paper evaluation functions will provide multiple lenses onto the literature. So we'll have this network with all this public evaluative information, and an individual scientist, if he's a bit of a geek, he might write his own paper evaluation function. But similarly, institutes or societies, like the Society for Neuroscience, or a public policy think tank, or other groups like Science Magazine, might define their own paper evaluation functions, where they weight the evidence differently, where they perhaps weight the reviewers differently, right? For example, we could think about things like weighting the reviewers by their H index or something like this to give sort of more senior experts greater weight. And this will result in a constantly evolving and competing plurality of paper evaluation functions, which essentially produce an ungameable evaluation system, because if someone tried to game it, for example, by giving a lot of anonymous flack to competitors, then the evaluation side of the system can just respond to that by downweighting, for example, anonymous reviews and ratings. So, as for designing an open evaluation system, I think designing this is really part of scientific methods development. So that relates very well to Tim's title for the conference, that users should be more involved in designing the form of the system. And I think the future system will derive its authority from the scientific literature on open evaluation. This is because different from user rating systems like on Amazon.com or for other products, for the scientific literature we have a greater need for justification of whatever system we use to evaluate papers and claims, right? So therefore we want the whole process of this evaluation to be well documented, well justified by a scientific literature on it. And I'm starting to sort of work in that direction by editing a collection of papers on it for Frontiers in Computational Neuroscience. So this is a collection of papers where we invite authors to envision the future system, sort of along the lines of what I've told you, but this is just sort of one vision. It's somewhat vague, and there might be alternative good solutions. So I'm hoping to bring together sort of 10 to 20 visions in this collection, and you're all welcome to contribute if you're interested, if you have ideas on this. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions for Nico?
Very interesting, futuristic ideas. Can you tell us what you do with bias? How you remove the bias in the future? Because in the scientific world, there's a lot of bias. How can you get rid of that bias?
In the scientific world, there is a lot of bias, and how can you remove the bias out of the futuristic system?
Yeah, that's a deep problem that you're bringing up, and I think ultimately there is no solution to this problem. And the reason is that there is no principled way of distinguishing bias from good judgment, right? I mean, bias means that you have assumptions before you come to your judgment, right? And if those assumptions are correct, then that improves your inference, right? That's just sort of the fact of Bayesian inference. And so ultimately there is no solution. However, I feel that making things completely transparent reduces the bias very strongly, because everyone expressing a judgment or evaluating a paper has the eyes of the entire community and really of history on him, especially if it's a signed judgment, right? So people will be very careful, I think, not to appear to be biased in favor of their own direction of research.
Let's, so a number of journals have experimented with versions of post-publication peer review plus one. Nature had a commenting system that they trialed for a while. For the most part, those systems haven't worked too well because very few scientists can be bothered to comment, and so very few papers attract any evaluations at all.
Yes.
How do you've of course articulated that scientists do have some incentives to comment, but apparently those incentives, at least at the moment, aren't that strong.
Yes.
Could you comment on that?
So the first comment is that we're all very busy and we're already doing reviews for the current system, right? And that reduces our motivation to do additional work reviewing papers. The other problem is that we might be afraid of going out there, adding a comment and signing it, and then if it's a negative comment, maybe the authors don't like us. We want to keep that. We could comment anonymously, obviously. But this underlines sort of a more general point, which is that the greatest challenge in moving toward the future, I think, is social engineering rather than getting the software, right? The software, of course, that's also critical and is part of it, really, because if we want to change this culture toward a culture where every scientist sees sort of an open commenting as part of his or her contribution to steering the attention of the entire field, then yeah, we need to completely change our attitudes there, yes. So that it is a problem.
In the open evaluation model, I'm concerned about the role of the journal in this model. At what point does an article become, I guess, published under the auspices of the journal and accepted as a definitive piece of research?
I think there'll be a transition period where everything's going to work as it does now. Only in addition to the pre-publication peer review that the journals administer, there'll be post-publication further evaluation, right? And in this transition period, the post-publication system will have to prove itself, and it faces these obstacles, including the one that Jeremy mentioned. But the tipping point would be reached when people trust the evaluation from the post-publication system more than journal prestige, right? Because that's the point where journal prestige is sort of not strictly needed anymore, right? And at that point, publications could be just posted. However, they'd have to be registered, obviously. They'd have to be part of a crystallized and citable scientific record that's maintained for perpetuity.
Hi, at least at my journal, part of the value of the peer review process is the revision that happens in response to peer reviews. A weak argument becomes a compelling argument because an author sees something he missed in a peer review.
Yeah.
In your post-publication review system, where does that happen? And how do you track whether the evaluation you're reading is actually for the paper you see?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So, for one thing, authors will have greater responsibility to get their paper into a very good shape before they publish, because that's the moment that the whole world can see it potentially, right? So I foresee that authors will distribute the paper to other researchers they trust, and there'll be this sort of informal pre-publication improvement of the paper, and that will have a greater role than now. In addition, the formal system, post-initial publication, also needs a mechanism for revisions, right? So the way this would work is a paper accumulates these evaluative, this evaluative material, and when the authors decide that this rises to their threshold for action, they can revise the paper and address those comments, and the revision will then supersede the original submission. However, the original version will always be available. They can never take that back. It's only that the revision is the thing that the readers will see first, and all the judgments will need to be updated.
So, I think this could possibly happen. I mean, the thing you haven't mentioned at all is in the real world, especially in the States, I have my feet, you know, I'm an editor and I'm a working scientist. And the thing that you're always fighting with is you always have to make sure that the system above you that's evaluating you at the university or your research institute cares that you do this. And I can tell you that right now, could care less. Because if it doesn't bring money, they don't want you to do it. And that's real. That's something we have to deal with now and in the future. And that relates to a question my colleague had. Who pays for all this? Because right now, our time pressure is so great, no one's going to do this. And I'm not trying to be, I think this is happening. And it's going to happen in phases, but you're talking about a lot of selfless activity, not selfish activity. Because you have to sit there and take days to think about a paper and then evaluate if you're going to do it as well as you would like. I don't see that happening. I don't.
I agree that's a very important concern, but remember, it's already happening that we're reviewing papers, right? It takes me a full day to review a paper. There is no money coming from that. I could always say no. I say no most of the time already, right? So if I always said no, actually, I don't think anything would change, but I still do it, and my institute sees it as part of my job. I don't think in the new system we should spend any more time doing this. We'll just do all of it out in the open. And we'll have additional motivation through the fact that we're signing those reviews, so it's sort of an activity that's rewarded with reputation, if not with money, right? And this could also be measured then. Unlike the present system, my institute doesn't know how much time I spent reviewing papers. However, if they were all in the open, they're sort of like mini publications, right? And this contribution to the whole process can be measured as well.
Where does the first paper get posted? Is that you submit it to a journal and say, this is my first version of the paper for open peer review?
I think part of the openness should be that you can publish it in any journal, right? And it's so using the existing infrastructure, and it should still be possible for it to be part of the post-publication evaluation. Eventually, I think there might, one way to envision this would be a PubMed kind of investment into a repository where you can sort of immediately publish by submitting your work to the repository, and it will be automatically published.
So the journal then just takes anything that an author chooses to submit to their site.
Exactly, and there'll be sort of the line between published and unpublished, or between scientific publication and unpublished or manuscript or blog post will become somewhat fuzzy, as there will be lots of citable publications that have never been evaluated and are not really part of the literature in any deeper sense, right? And the crucial step, the crucial bar will then be to have the paper be interesting enough to a small community of scientists that it will be peer evaluated, right? And then it becomes real in that sense.
Hi. It seems like an interesting addition to your system might be the way it would dovetail with the movement to have scientists make publicly available the data that lies behind their published work. So that if, for instance, in evaluating a paper, then you could then look at the original data set the scientists used, because that were also publicly available in some sort of archive. That would obviously, if you had the time, make an even more informed evaluation of the actual work.
I agree, that's a great idea, and we should move in that direction. It's not equally easy in every field. Of course, some kinds of data are very sort of standard, and they're not unwieldy in terms of hundreds of gigabytes, right? And I think those should be the first ones that we should encourage people to include. But also in fields like my field, where the data is really substantial, and the descriptive information you need to analyze it is also complex and substantial. Attempts in that direction have been made, and they haven't been very successful, but that's, I think, because of just the difficulty of this scientific problem.
Do you think that this will work in all disciplines? I'm thinking particularly like in biomedicine, if a practitioner or a researcher published something and a patient grabs onto that, and it's basically unvetted. There may be errors that the author didn't catch. Even in the process of publishing something, putting it up, somebody can transpose a number here or there, and that could actually have significant effect on the patient who takes that information and uses it incorrectly. So do you think this is something that will work across the board?
Well, I think this problem that the scientific literature is never going to be 100% correct, and people, for example, lay people or patients might not know to take it with a grain of salt, as scientists would who work in the same field. That's a problem in any system, right? So the higher the quality of the evaluation, the more we address this problem. Right, so I would say that the problem you're raising is exactly so one aspect of the problem that this kind of system would attempt to address, namely to get evaluations that are more reliable than the ones we currently have, where there's just 2 to 4 reviews and we don't know by whom, and we have no indication as to whether we can trust those evaluations.
Thank you very much, Nico.